Okay. Hello, everyone. I think our being host. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good to see everybody. Hi, good morning, good evening, and good day. I'm not sure. I better cover my bases. We have a very global turnout, so I cover all the time zones. I hope everyone's doing fine. 1 second, I have a dog. Forgive me. That was a COVID-19 working from home dog bark that I had to take care of. So anyway, welcome to WildChina Conversation Series. My name is May. A lot of you know me, some of you don't. I'm the founder of WildChina, so allow me to say a few words about WildChina, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker, Patrick, in a little bit. WildChina does work in travel sphere, but I never really thought of ourselves as a travel agency, really. Instead, I think of us in the business of fostering understanding of China on a very human level. So in the past, we arranged travel to China, to see the China that's behind the New York Times or Fox News, whatever it is, right? Now we can't. So we thought, okay, why don't we bring China to you? Has nothing to do with politics or trade wars or, you know, any of the things that are covered in Wall Street Journal. But we do want to talk about food, art, architecture, history, literature, in pursuit of a common sense of commonality of humans across the world, really, regardless of borders. So to kick off this series, I can't be happier to have Patrick, whom you see already on the screen. Patrick is a longtime friend of WildChina, and he's going to talk to us about Shanghai. Now, anybody who has had the good fortune of walking through the French concession with Patrick would know what it is like. Patrick not only gives a ton of information, not only imparts knowledge, but what I think is even better is he's the perfect kind of interpreter for Shanghai. He provokes you to think a little bit more. Where did Shanghai come from? Where's Shanghai now? And where's Shanghai going? And not Shanghai in a sort of geographical city sense, more on a human level, I believe, right? So that very much in line with what we want to talk about. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Patrick's brief bio. For those in the US, a couple of keywords to connect. Baltimore. Now, how did you make it from Baltimore to Shanghai? But I would say Shanghai is a more exciting city. That's where Patrick grew up, and he holds...
Hey, you just lost the whole Baltimore fan base.
Forgive me. But there, Patrick also holds degree from Brown, University of Michigan, Ross Business School, Johns Hopkins, and even University of Dijon. Am I pronouncing that correct? I want to find out more about that connection too. Now, Patrick, besides talking about Shanghai, he's one of the best known historian, speaker on Shanghai history and architecture. But beyond that, Patrick has been in China, been studying China for more than 30 years. And he's been living in Shanghai since 1997. So his passion is really history, architecture, urban development of his new home, which is Shanghai. And besides that, on business front, Patrick used to run Cigna in China. And then he founded his own business in strategy communications called Asia Media. He also was very active in the business AmCham community, acted as governor and a chairman before. And now comes to the part that's most relevant to our discussion is in 1998, Patrick, together with Tess Johnston and Tina, right, founded this organization called Historic Shanghai. This is the best local organization that organizes events for the Shanghai community to preserve and talk about history of Shanghai. Right now, Patrick also sits on, is a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and a board member of the International Coalition of Art Deco Societies. Now, I'm going to switch. Today, we're going to have half an hour of conversation between us, and then all of you are more than welcome to put in questions in the dialogue section. I'm going to read them out, and Patrick will get to them in a little bit. The first question I have is, Patrick, you're so busy with business. How did you become a Shanghai expert? I sort of envision you spending all your weekends walking in like French concession. How did you do it?
Well, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. You just start walking and don't stop. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, May. I really appreciate it. WildChina is a terrific organization, and your mission of increasing people's understanding of contemporary as well as historic Shanghai is a noble cause. So, and thanks to all the folks who have tuned in. I see friends on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. So that's wonderful. Tina and I arrived in Shanghai in 1998 from Beijing. I had studied in Nanjing before that and studied China for many, many years. And it still didn't prepare us for what we found in Shanghai. And as we walked around and saw all these beautiful buildings, we asked people about them, and we did not get very good answers. In part because, the Chinese have been told that the Western buildings in Shanghai that are so ubiquitous here are reminders of a humiliating period in Chinese history. So over the years, many of the stories had been lost, and we wanted to find out more. So we collect resources. We have a small library, some of which you see here, that we refer to when we do research. We talked to people in the neighborhoods that we walked through, and eventually worked up enough stories to share them with other people that we had met in Shanghai who were equally interested. So yes, it's been a weekend passion for a long time now.
That's wonderful. But why Shanghai? I mean, people think of China, Imperial Beijing has so much richness to it. The sort of dizzying Hong Kong has so much glamour to it. Why Shanghai? Why did you choose to base yourself there? It has very short history.
That, of course, is well said, May, but from the perspective of a longtime Beijing resident, I think. Yes, Beijing was the imperial capital for many centuries, but Shanghai is where Imperial China first encountered intimately the rest of the world after many centuries of self-isolation, a very current term. And it was in Shanghai that modern businesses developed and modern cultural traditions, if you will. And very quickly, I mean, for more than 100 years, Shanghai has been one of the largest cities in the world by population. And for many years, it was and is again one of the world's great cities. You don't feel in Beijing the same way you do in Shanghai. People from New York, for instance, when they get off the plane and start to explore Shanghai, they get it right away because they feel that energy in the streets. It's something that's very difficult to put into words what that energy is. But there's a thrill to Shanghai that is unlike, shall we say, Beijing's.
Well, maybe you can walk us back a little bit on the founding of Shanghai's history compared to Guangzhou, because I would say Guangzhou was one of the first cities encountered Western trade and commerce as well. How come it didn't happen in Guangzhou, but instead it's in Shanghai?
Yes, well, you've asked the critical question. So without going into too much detail, in the 19th century, there were foreign countries, traders from foreign countries that traded in just one city, Canton. That was the only city, Guangzhou, right? That was the only city that the Qing authorities allowed foreigners to trade in. And the major maritime power at that time was the British Empire, and they wanted to trade more widely in China than just Canton. So they fought a war with China. And at the end of the war, the two sides, the Qing imperial government and the British imperial government, signed a treaty that allowed the British to choose 4 more cities in which to trade. And Shanghai was one of them. And it was chosen because it was already a good-sized port, strategically located near the mouth of the Yangtze River, which is in the region where some of the most valuable commodities of trade were produced, that is silk, tea, fine porcelain. And so it quickly developed as a strategic port for international trade and quickly outstripped Guangzhou. And Hong Kong at this time was also a minor player in trade. So for most of the period of the last 100 and what odd years, Shanghai has been a bigger port than either of those.
So would it make sense if I were to understand, in terms of access to port and trade to internationally, Hong Kong and Shanghai were about the same, but in terms of access to supply side, so tea, fine porcelain, Shanghai is better strategically located, and that sort of gave it the soil to grow from.
That's right. That's right. And from today's perspective, Hong Kong is, in some people's eyes, a more important strategic city. But it's important to remember that actually Hong Kong was a backwater compared to Shanghai in the 1920s and 30s. And it was only after the revolution of 1949 that Hong Kong's economy started to boom. You know why? Because some of the Shanghai business people went there and brought with them their business savvy. So there's a very intimate connection between Shanghai and Hong Kong to this very day.
You know, it's very interesting. One of our speakers in 10 days from now is the grandson of Xu Zhimo, and his grandmother, Xu Zhimo's wife, divorced wife, started banking in Shanghai very early in the 1930s or something, and then eventually moved all the banking to Hong Kong around 1949-ish. Same as what you were talking about, right?
That's right. She and her associates were some of the first, big-time business women. And think about that. Until the end of the Qing dynasty, women were meant to stay at home and seldom went out of the domestic realm. But in the 1920s and 30s, not only did business change for men, but women were liberated to participate more fully in the broad society, including business. And she was a pioneer. And it all happened in Shanghai.
I know, that's so impressive. Very interesting. Now, how you moved to Shanghai in 1998? Was it 97?
97.
97, when Hong Kong came back to China. You decided to leave Hong Kong. So the Shanghai that you've experienced must have changed tremendously. Was there a Pudong back then? Give us a sense of layout changes.
Sure. Unfortunately, many of the guidebooks say, Pudong was just rice fields. So that's not the case. Even 100 years ago, Pudongs along the riverside had many warehouses, ships chandlers, factories over there. So it was not just agricultural, but just a little ways past the river, yes, there were villages and farms all the way to the coast. When we arrived, the redevelopment of the area of Pudong closest to the old part of Shanghai, called Lujiazui, was already underway.
In 97?
In 19 Shanghai municipal government, but in 1990, the Shanghai municipal government announced that they were going to conduct an international competition for the design of a new urban center in Pudong. And by the early 90s, the selected program was underway. So I think the Pearl Tower was completed in 1995. The other tall buildings followed. But to give you a sense, when we arrived in 97, the area of Pudong called Lujiazui was a big construction site. But my first office was on the Pudong side, so I traveled there even in 1997.
But nowadays, Pudong, just for some of our audience who may not have been to Shanghai, Pudong is the east side of Shanghai, and Puxi is the west side of Shanghai, separated by the Pu River, right? And Pudong, Huangpu River. That's right, Huangpu River. And I've heard certain people referring to Pudong as Pu Jersey. It's sort of a little bit like Manhattan to Brooklyn sort of relationship, different parts. But Pudong is the financial center of China right now. Now, you mentioned earlier that people from New York immediately get to Shanghai and can sense the energy and sort of can understand what the city is about. There is a similar sense, in a way. I'm going to be completely on PC here because we are in a private conversation room. I'm from Yunnan, so people from the rest of China look at Shanghai a little bit like people from the rest of America look at New Yorkers. They kind of go, the Shanghai people are very business-minded. What is your perception of Shanghai people when you first moved there, and what about them that attracted you to stay for so long?
Right. Well, the analogy between Shanghai and the rest of China and New York and the rest of the United States is a very valid one, right? So people from outside of New York think that New Yorkers are a bunch of arrogant SOBs. But of course, New Yorkers think that people from the rest of the country are not as sophisticated and as cool as they are. And, to some extent, they're both right. But the point is that the relationship between Shanghai and the rest of the country is quite like that. And by the way, the analogy between Beijing and Washington, D.C. is also a pretty valid one. Those are both the political centers, and people there are focused very much on the workings of government, whereas people in other cities place less emphasis on those kinds of activities.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go back to the architecture front because I have a whole list of questions about Shanghai in my head that now I get to ask you. The Bund, the most famous Bund. Why is it called such a strange name?
Well, that's a good story. First of all, the Bund is the waterfront boulevard along the Huangpu River, famous for its line of beautiful Western-style buildings. Where did the word Bund come from? Well, it's like a lot of words in the English language that we use all the time, we don't realize, were borrowed by the British when they were the colonial masters in India. You put on your khakis or your pajamas, you sit on the veranda of your bungalow. These are all Indian words. So Bund is an Indian word that means the embankment of a river. And it's a generic word. There's other bunds in the world, but the most famous one is the Shanghai Bund.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't hear you right now.
Now
there you are.
Now you can. I unmuted myself to pour myself some hot water and got cut out. So the Bund, what are the most famous buildings when you walk on there that you stop at? Tell us some of these stories. Were they as expensive to build back then in history as they are now to, say, acquire any of them?
Well, no, I mean, there's no place that's as cheap as it was 100 years ago. No, your Western money went a long way back then. So many of these buildings, no expense was spared, and they're, at the time, they were state of the art. by my count, there's 24 buildings on the Bund. Some may say more, some may say less. And they come from several different eras in Shanghai's history. So the first generation buildings were built very quickly in the 1840s and 50s, and they deteriorated very quickly. They were built in the British colonial style with wide verandas. They were replaced by the second generation of buildings, which were built a little bit more sturdily with brick or stone walls. And that generation was replaced in the early part of the 20th century when building techniques had changed. So reinforced concrete and steel frame construction revolutionized construction. So most of the buildings that you see on the Bund are from that third generation, built between 1910 and 1925 in neoclassical style. And then there's a fourth generation as well, which are the Art Deco buildings. And there are three of those. And interestingly, they were built in three different decades. 1929, the Peace Hotel, as we know it today. Cathay Hotel was its original name. And that's one of the landmarks that everyone who comes to Shanghai must visit, although it's closed right now for renovations and special period. And right next to it is another Art Deco building completed in 1935, the Bank of China building. And that is a great example of the subgenre of Art Deco architecture called Chinese Art Deco. And because it has a Chinese style roof and lattice work windows and two mythical beasts guarding the entrance to the bank. So that's also one not to miss. And the former Hong Kong Shanghai Bank building, completed in 1923, so a third generation building, is also a must see during banking hours though, because the interior is extremely elaborate and has beautiful mosaics that depict some of the major cities where Hong Kong Shanghai Bank had branches back then. And it's breathtaking and quite unlike what many visitors expect when they come to China, right?
Can you just walk in?
If you're properly dressed and it's banking hours, yes.
Interesting. So what are the features of Art Deco? I hear this word often, but I can't pinpoint it.
Yeah, well, most people can't, so don't feel bad about that.
My
Art
job
Deco,
is to ask silly questions.
yeah. So, and Art Deco in part is in the eye of the beholder. I would encourage anyone who's interested in that particular style to visit shanghaiartdeco.net and also to research online. As you mentioned, I'm a board member of the International Coalition of Art Deco Societies. And every 2 years, one of the members of the society all around the world hosts the World Congress on Art Deco. And it was our turn in 2015, so we hosted at that time. So the way we explain Art Deco in as few words as possible is that Art Deco was a reaction against the over-ornamented styles that we know as Victorian and Art Nouveau style. And it was a celebration of modernity and the changes that science and technology were bringing to people's lives. It was a celebration of speed and urbanization. And the buildings and the design reflected, the design of many things reflected that a celebration of modernity. So early Art Deco, you get a transition from organic shapes, motifs, ornamentation. Organic, I mean birds and flowers and plants, curly things, to more geometric design. Some people called early Art Deco the zigzag style. Famous examples, right, would be the Art Deco skyscrapers in New York, and in Shanghai, the Fairmont Peace Hotel, or the Cathay Hotel as it was known back then, is a great example of that early Art Deco style. Lots of ornamentation, but it is more geometric, simplified. And then Art Deco very rapidly developed or progressed into interim genre we call streamline modern. And at this point, the hard edges of the geometric design started to become more smooth and rounded, and there was much less ornamentation. Some good examples are some of the buildings down in Miami Beach. Simple, but clearly modern.
What is this?
And then, at least streamlined modern.
Okay.
Modern is the French term for modern. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and then some people believe or consider the third period to be a period of very devoid of all ornamentation and more asymmetric in design. Others would say, oh, no. You show a third period Art Deco building in Shanghai to a European, and they'll say, oh no, that's Bauhaus. So those who are familiar with architecture design in the audience now will say, oh yeah, I know, Bauhaus, 1920. The point is that school of architecture, which was founded by a number of German architects, was 15 or 20 years ahead of its time. And yes, the world came round to their ideas. And that's what formed the basis for mid-century modern architecture in the rest of the world.
So when people like look at houses here, where I am in Berkeley, when they say mid-century modern, that came after Art Deco. Art Deco yes. is a time period and a style. Maybe it's more style of that period. Okay.
Yeah. And basically that's it.
Okay, but it's very interesting. Thank you for explaining that. Now, following along that line of thought, in Shanghai, you explained there are some Art Deco buildings along the Bund. Does the same style carry through to the French Concession, to say the Shikumen? I mean, where do those fall into? Maybe you give our listeners a little bit layout of the difference of the three.
Okay, well, the short answer is there's Art Deco all over Shanghai. And during the World Congress in Art Deco in 2015, we ran 5 different tours. One was along the western part of Nanjing Road, which is, the major thoroughfare through the old part of the city. Another was in the western part of the French Concession. Another was around the People's Square area. Mm-hmm. One was in the old city. So even inside the formerly walled old city, there are buildings that were built in the 1920s and 30s that reflect Art Deco design. And then we also went up to the Wujiaochang area in Yangpu district, so up in the northeastern part of Shanghai, where in the 1930s, the nationalist government started to build a new government center for the Shanghai administered part of the city. And those buildings reflected in another subgenre, Ming Revival, or what they call Nanjing Decade style, which is more ornamented, but in a Chinese style. So there's so much to see. And if you research this online, there are many cities that claim that they have the most Art Deco buildings in the world. And we categorically say, no, that's wrong. Shanghai has the most. And if you visit the website that we operate, historic-shanghai.com or shanghaiartdeco.net, you'll find a database of Art Deco buildings. So we're actually quantifying the number of buildings in Shanghai that are Art Deco. Now, there are other cities that have a higher percentage of Art Deco buildings, like Miami Beach, and famously Napier, New Zealand, which was flattened by an earthquake and in 1930, and they rebuilt all at the same time, all in the same design. But in terms of absolute numbers of Art Deco buildings, it's Shanghai.
Okay. Yeah, just for the audience, do not panic if you did not write down the URLs for these websites. We will recap them in our blog post afterwards. Now, very interesting. I want to take some of these walks. A friend of mine described Shanghai. He said the best way to explore Shanghai is by walking, because Shanghai is a city cut to human size. Well, in Beijing, you can't walk anywhere because it's too big. Is that your preferred approach to explore Shanghai?
Oh, yes. And it is one of the great things about Shanghai. It is a very walkable city. It also happens to have the largest and newest subway system in the world, and you can get anywhere in the city very quickly and easily. So yes, that's a valid observation. Beijing, like Xi'an, was an imperial city, and it was built on a monumental scale in order to inspire awe, right? Oh, going to see the emperor, bow and be intimidated. So the boulevards in Beijing were built very wide in order to inspire that awe and a spirit of grandeur. Whereas Shanghai was built in an organic way by business people for their comfort and convenience. And it is a comfortable, convenient city and a great place to walk also because it is, at least in some parts, it's lined with trees because it gets hot here in the summertime, but many streets have a canopy of leaves overhead to keep the streets comfortable for walkers.
Yeah. Did you ever research those? I love those trees in Shanghai streets. Those are plane trees, right? Did you ever research who brought them to Shanghai? Do they relate directly to the French concession?
Yeah, so one of the great pleasures of taking people on walking tours here is I get to meet people from all over the world and all walks of life. And inevitably, I was on a walk with a British fellow who was in charge of a botanical garden in the United States. And he told me that the plane trees are actually hybrids. There's a European variety and an American variety. And apparently somebody made a hybrid of those two and brought them from Europe to the French concession. So you'll find them mostly in the French concession, but you'll also find them in other parts of the city. And interestingly, in 1927, Chiang Kai-shek, who became president of China for a number of years, reestablished the capital of China in Nanjing. So government offices moved to Nanjing, many of them from Shanghai, and the city designers brought plane trees to Nanjing. So you'll see them all over that lovely city, also a wonderful city to visit. So it's not just in the French concession that you'll find those trees, but yes, they were brought over for practical reasons, and they're still fulfilling that function today.
Beautiful, yeah. No, I love the French concession. Maybe for the benefit of our audience, give us a little brief history of the French concession and your favorite way to visit. Which are the must?
Okay. So let's go back to the time when the British fought the First Opium War and came to Shanghai, opened the port as a British port, right? Well, the other major maritime powers in the world did not want to see the British have a monopoly on trade with China in these so-called treaty ports. And so these other nations sent representatives to China to sign bilateral treaties with the Qing imperial government, allowing their citizens to live and work in treaty ports. The second country to arrive in Shanghai, just after the British, United States of America. And they set up shop just north of the area that the British had started, the Bund area. And then the French arrived and they set up their operations just south of the Bund, along the riverside, the French Bund, as the English speakers called it, the Quai de France. And that was the beginning of the French concession down near the river. And then lots of other countries came and made similar deals. But these guys were all sailors, they didn't know the first thing about running a colony. So in 1863, 20 years after the British arrived, all of the foreigners got together and they formed a multinational government for the foreign parts of Shanghai, whereby any foreigner who owned a certain amount of property here could vote for representation on the Shanghai Municipal Council, a committee of businessmen that ran the affairs of the foreign parts of the city. And all the nations in Shanghai went in together on this, except for the French, who felt that they should have their own, keep their own part of Shanghai. And they started their own municipal council. They had their own police force, their own judiciary, etc. And so the French concession and the international settlement developed together alongside each other. And the French concession, just like the international settlement, moved west. So by the 1920s, both of them were much, much larger than they had been in the 19th century. And the western part of the French concession was the last part of the foreign settlements to be developed after World War I. And that's the area we most frequently walk in to see the lovely houses and beautiful Art Deco apartment buildings and residences in the leafy part of the Western French concession.
Which are the
and there's not just one place. Which are the streets? Well, the main street that goes east and west through the old French concession is today called Huaihai Road. Almost all the names of the streets in the French concession were changed, of course, from French names to Chinese names after the Second World War, and then they were changed again after the Revolution of 1949. So that complicates our research a little bit, but it's part of the fun.
I guess.
So Huaihai Road used to be called Avenue Joffre after the great French general of the First World War. But there's also Fuxing Road, as it's called today. Beautiful road to walk on. That was formerly Rue Lafayette, after another French general. So those are the two main streets. But of course, a lot of the fun is wandering off the main drag and just exploring in some of the smaller and lesser known streets.
Now, but moving along history, Shanghai has this particular attraction to quite a few of our Jewish clients.
Right, it's a very, very important city in Jewish history. And there were three main migrations of Jews to Shanghai. So in the 19th century, Jews from the Middle Eastern, some Middle Eastern countries came to Shanghai to trade. Sephardic Jews. There's two main schools in Judaism, Sephardim and Ashkenazi. They're two different traditions of Judaism. So the first were Sephardic Jews who came to trade, and some of them did very, very well and became some of the wealthiest families in town and the best known names. And most people who come to Shanghai hear very quickly about Sir Viktor Sassoon, who was instrumental in building many of the beautiful buildings that still stand today, including the Fairmont Peace Hotel, the Cathay Hotel. But it was his grandfather who established the company way back in 1845 in Shanghai. So he's not the only Sassoon.
What did they trade on? What did they trade on?
What did they trade? They trade the main commodities that were traded at that time. So silk, tea, and of course, opium, which was produced mostly in British India and brought to China via the treaty ports. Very controversial subject, but let's get back to the Jews. So after 1900, there were Russian Jews from the Ashkenazi tradition who came to China to escape anti-Semitic pogroms in Imperial Russia. And then after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, many, many Russians, the so-called white Russians, to distinguish them from the Reds, the communist Bolsheviks, came to Shanghai, maybe 15,000 Russians, and about a quarter of them were Jewish. Yeah.
Wow.
So actually the largest largest number of foreigners living in the French concession in the 1920s and 30s was Russian. They were more Russians than Frenchmen in the French concession.
What
Anyway,
amazing, just amazing, astonishing number.
It is amazing.
Yeah.
But most visitors who are Jewish may not have heard of those two migrations, but rather of the third migration of Jews, which were from Europe, right? Escaping Nazi persecution. So they came in the late 1930s and early 1940s. And of course, these guys came with only the shirts on their backs and a suitcase. So they were in very bad shape. Several groups of Jews banded together who were already living in Shanghai, banded together and formed community assistance organizations. So Sir Viktor Sassoon was a major player in that help. But then the Japanese military attacked, and they occupied most of eastern China starting in 1937. It was a very interesting time in Shanghai because the Japanese army they took the Chinese-controlled area outside of the foreign settlements, but they dare not come into the foreign settlements because that would be considered an act of war against the Western powers, right? But on December 8th, 1941, that's December 7th in Pearl Harbor, in came the Japanese and they occupied. Yeah. And at that point, the Japanese authorities came under pressure from their German allies to take care of the Jews the way they were taking care of them in Europe.
Oh my God.
Yeah, terrifying time. But the Japanese had no issue with the Jews. They were just Europeans like anybody else in their eyes, number one. Number two, the Japanese already had a very bad public relations problem because they had been raping and pillaging all over Asia for 4 years by that time. So they compromised with the Germans. And instead of setting up extermination camps, they designated an area of the city where Jews were required to move. It became known as the Jewish ghetto. So for 2.5 years, only the Jews who had arrived from Europe were required to move up there. And, conditions were terrible. Conditions were terrible in the internment camps where Americans, British, Australians, Dutch were interned during the war. Terrible time. But after the war, the Jews in Shanghai, like many foreign residents, they emigrated out of Shanghai and went to the four corners of the earth. So you will find old Shanghai Jews, as they call themselves, all over the world.
Interesting. So
and we get many of them as visitors.
I bet. Yeah, it's a very sort of emotional kind of experience for a lot of these guests. I understand. Yeah. How did they come from Europe? By ship over coming?
They came. Depends on when. Early on, they came mostly by ship out of Italian ports. But when Mussolini joined the Axis, that was cut off. So the last refugees, Jewish refugees from Europe, came across the Trans-Siberian Railway. Yeah.
Oh wow! What an amazing history. Many of our listeners in China probably don't know very well that we had this part. Now, changing to a much lighter subject, and we only have 15 minutes. I know there are questions. If you have any questions, start inputting them. But I'm going to ask some lighter questions. Your favorite places to eat in Shanghai?
Oh, well,
short list.
This is the world city, and it depends what you're interested in eating. But we have food from all over the place.
How about Shanghai food? Shanghai food.
Shanghai food. Yeah, there's a couple of places. They're of course confidential. You want to know? You have to get me. No, I'm just kidding. You never want to ruin the secrets. But there's a lovely restaurant not far from where our office used to be, which is just a neighborhood joint. It's got all of the classics and served in a nice way. It's on Mao Ming Road. I can find the address and all that for you later.
Okay.
There's also wonderful, Shanghai, like most of the great cities of the world, is a city of immigrants. There are people from all over China who have made Shanghai their home. And in the early days, and still to some extent, the largest group is from the two neighboring provinces, Jiangsu province and Zhejiang province. And both of those places have their own culinary traditions as well. So there's a Ningbo restaurant, which is wonderful. The cuisine is more heavy use of pickled vegetables and different cooking techniques. That's right off of Yan'an Road, actually, and a nice place to go. Plus, the owner likes to tell you all about each dish. So, fortunately, not in Ningbo dialect, which is impossible to understand.
Okay, anyone wants to get these sort of hole-in-the-wall places with no names, I'm going to track them down with Patrick. You have to come back next session to get the names. Now, we do have a couple of questions here. The first one, when I walk along the Bund, it seems like there are two layers of architecture and life. The first layer is the foreign-style buildings along the Bund. But if you walk a little further from the Bund, just a couple of blocks away, it suddenly becomes quiet and occupied by not so fashionable Chinese residence buildings. I find this contrast very interesting. Could you elaborate more? Very good question.
It is a good question, and the Bund is a showpiece, right? It is squeaky clean. The promenade along the river has been elaborately landscaped. The buildings undergo a great deal of maintenance, etc. But you're absolutely right. Just paces from that showpiece, there are many Shanghai residents who are living very ordinary and meager lives. The income inequality in China is now even greater than it is in the United States.
Yeah.
And we all know that in the United States, it's not getting any more equal.
Narrower.
So there are a lot of wealthy people in Shanghai, and you will be stunned by the cavalcade of gorgeous exotic cars that you see in Shanghai. But most people are living very ordinary, meager lives. And just off of the Bund, there are several lane neighborhoods, as well as buildings that were not originally built for residences, where there are many, many families living in tight quarters. And depending on who I'm taking around, sometimes I show them that. Some people don't want to see that. But it is a very interesting contrast, and I try to make that part of my tours as well.
But do these Shanghainese also own those properties? Then they would be like millionaires instantly.
Yeah, it's very, very complicated home ownership. I mean, 35 years ago, no one in China owned their own home in the cities, right? The government assigned you a place to live. So some people in Shanghai and everywhere in China are living in what we would know in the United States as rent control. So they pay a very modest sum to a government real estate management organization to live in the space that may have been assigned to them many decades ago. Mm. Some of those residents have purchased at greatly discounted prices their apartments from the government, and they become homeowners. Others have purchased new apartments in new buildings in different parts of the city. So there's actually a very high percentage now of home ownership in Shanghai. Some people have sublet those living spaces to others. So in one building, you can find many, many different ownership situations. It's not an easy question to answer.
Right,
right. So, but well asked.
Yeah.
Any other
Uh,
questions?
yeah, there are lots. One a quick one is M on the Bun still there? Bruce loved the couple of meals he had there. Is it still there?
Short
It,
answer, short answer, yes.
perfect. Do you go to the glam bar at M on the Bun? No, no,
Um,
that's
there's so many great bars in Shanghai. That's another, and actually our group Historic Shanghai sometimes runs walks that are focused on the history of drinking in Shanghai.
oh, that's fun. How about jazz? This is my question. I know the Peace Hotel has a famous jazz band. Do you still go to Shanghai to look for the jazz band?
Well, there's not enough jazz in Shanghai, and the jazz band at the Fairmont Peace Hotel is more of a marketing thing. If you're a real jazz fan, there are several clubs to go to. There's even a jazz school in Shanghai, but it's there's not enough jazz in Shanghai, I would say.
Okay.
Now, Lincoln Center, the Jazz at Lincoln Center actually set up a branch here. Unfortunately, bringing in jazz musicians from the United States. Unfortunately, the COVID situation has canceled many of those. I was looking forward to a number of concerts this coming spring, but they're
Season.
canceled.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, we have to get that secret jazz list from you as well. Now, Greg from
Yes.
Facebook, we do have, it's broadcasted live on Facebook as well. It says, from my experience, most Shanghainese have very little knowledge of pre-1949 history. Do you see any growing interest from Chinese people in their city's history?
Yes, actually, that's a great question too. There is a Chinese language club that is that runs parallel to historic Shanghai, and they operate mostly in Shanghainese, um, and it's several hundred people, and they go out frequently to explore the city. Most of them, though, are older, and they lament that the younger generations don't have as much interest and certainly not as much knowledge as they do. And we're very glad that we've discovered them, because they are a great reservoir of knowledge about buildings that still stand and many that don't, because we've lost a lot of historic architecture here, and they have direct experience, and in some case documentation of those buildings that are now gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the audience, there are a few of our WildChina colleagues based in Shanghai. Any of you feel like you need to defend the reputation of the young Shanghainese? Contact Patrick and form a club to start exploring. Right. Okay, one question from Tom Gold. Oh, wow, very well-known scholar on China and retired professor from Berkeley. Thank you for joining us. So the question is, how sensitive are Chinese officials to efforts to stop tearing down buildings? Not just Art Deco, but Shikumen and Linong. A lot of beautiful buildings, including some synagogues, were helter-skelter, I don't understand this word, demolished in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm flattered that Professor Gold has tuned in. Thank you
Yes.
for tuning in and for the question. Well, like any controversial topic, the government manages controversies very carefully, and the same is true even for something that on the face of it is rather non-political, historic architecture. So as the professor well knows, but maybe the audience doesn't, there's no lobbying in China officially, and no protests allowed. So there's very little that ordinary citizens can do to express their opposition to urban redevelopment plans. The media is sometimes sensitive to these issues, and at least at times has run articles about both sides of the issue. But for the most part, the government controls the narrative, and the narrative is we don't want people living in substandard conditions. True. and we want a better life for everybody in Shanghai. You get the gist. The crux of the matter is, in many Western countries, it is private organizations that spearhead historic preservation efforts. There are no such organizations in China. So the decisions are made primarily by government offices. And in Shanghai, that's the Construction Bureau, the Planning Bureau, and the Cultural Affairs Bureau. And as you can imagine, it's usually the former two that have the influence. That being said, about 10 years ago, one of the professors from Tongji University's School of Architecture, a preservationist with wonderful credentials, was hired by the municipal government to advise the mayor. And because of his influence, the number of protected buildings went from several hundred to several thousand. So there are forces for preservation, but the level of influence is low.
Thank you for that. And from Linda Spiegler, hi Linda, she's calling from DC. Is there still a Jewish quarter today in Shanghai?
Right. There is a section of the Jewish ghetto. There wasn't really a Jewish ghetto in Shanghai per se. Jews lived all over the city, but during the war, the Japanese designated this area where Jews from Europe were required to move. And yes, you can go to that area. There are a few sites that you can walk that have not been, included as part of a tourist district. But there's also a museum, the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum, which is located in the synagogue, former synagogue, up there in the Hongkou section, and it's undergoing renovation, massive renovation right now. But it's very much worth a visit for anyone, not just Jews, who come to Shanghai. Now, it's important to note also, though, that there are only 5 recognized religions in China, and Judaism is not one of them. So ostensibly, you're not supposed to be able to worship, and there's no working synagogue in Shanghai, but there are several Jewish groups because, so there is religious life for Jews in Shanghai, but no synagogue to go to on a regular basis.
Okay. Now we only have 2 minutes left, but we have 3 questions because I have one we need to close on. So I'm going to just skip one and jump to the important. What are the biggest trends you see in the near future for Shanghai? This is from someone who probably knows you, Nancy Dempsey. What are the biggest trends you see?
Trends. Well, I'm mostly a history guy, not a forecasting type guy. But obviously, Shanghai and China are in a good position from an economic standpoint. But quite frankly, nobody knows what the economy worldwide is going to look like after the current situation subsides. So I'm not going to make any forecasts right now.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to wrap in Gloria Peng's question together with mine. She says, since you've lived there for 20 years, what do you most love about the city and what you don't like about the city? And so my question would be, if you had 48 hours, what's your itinerary to see the things you love?
Okay. Well, what I love about Shanghai is that energy and the culture. And I mean that from everything from interactions with ordinary people to high art. You can find it all here. And it's a friendly place. What I used to say that I didn't like about the city was pollution, but the pollution has been managed very aggressively, and it's not even a concern anymore. That's an important message for tourism, especially. 48 hours in Shanghai, well, you have to spend some time on the Bund, you have to spend some time in the French concession, and you should go up to either the Jewish ghetto or the old Shanghai municipal government area, get a little bit out of the beaten path and see a little bit of the old city as well, although that is rapidly disappearing, so better hurry.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. You timed it perfectly well. 1 hour, extremely informative and thought-provoking. As I mentioned, you're a great interpreter for Shanghai, really. we're highly indebted to you. And
I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So we will summarize most of these learnings today and also publish the recording in WildChina channels. So if any of you or your friends want to tune in and learn more, please stay in touch. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and have
Thanks, Meg.
a nice
Thank
day,
you.
Patrick. Thank you, everyone.